Welcome to all, students, alumni, faculty, staff, and friends of the program. We are delighted to invite you today to the Landscape Futures Symposium and our Centennial celebration. I'm Catherine Sievet, Meyerson Professor of Urbanism and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the Weitzman School of Design. I want to thank our Dean Fritz Steiner here in front. Thank you. Our amazing department administrative staff, Eric Barada, Aaron Abzarni, and Ray Zarati for their amazing support of this event. Our operations team under the direction of Carl Wellman and Sandy Mosco, and the entire Office of Development and Alumni Relations, including Jeff Snyder, Sonia Chen, Naomi Davidoff, Ember Bennett, and Ashley Colabella for all of the work and care they have taken for this occasion. It's quite extraordinary. A big round of applause. This was like a lot of work from a lot of people. So thank you, everyone, so much. Thanks. It really is extraordinary to mark this centennial occasion here in Meyerson Hall, flanked by extraordinary student work from 1967. My great thanks and hats off to Bill Whitaker of the Architectural Archives here at Penn for his generosity in curating this exhibition with us for this occasion. Thanks are also due to our MLA students Nitya Patel and Shubhra Goel, who aided in designing and hanging the work here and in the upper gallery. It's a selection of both archival gems and current student work from Bobby Petrusco's Media 3 class and Matt Neff's printmaking workshop. Adjacent to our stage here are the great mappings of the Delaware River Basin, executed by students of Ian McHarg during their graduate studies at UPenn. And I should note that some of their creators, our alumni, are here in this room today. The work served and continues to serve as referential touchpoints for the department and its landscape architecture students and studios for decades. We stand together in this room and on this ground, and we find ourselves and others standing on these maps, people, past, present, and future. For me, it's quite moving to think of these geological and hydrological studies of the Delaware River's watershed as a territorial portrait of Lenapehoking and all its beings. We live, we work, we study, and we draw on this ancestral homeland, territory, and landscape of the Lenni Lenape peoples. As members of an educational community, we're obligated to know the histories of dispossession that have allowed the University of Pennsylvania and our department, now in its 100th year, to grow and thrive on this vibrant terrain and in this watershed. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. As the saying goes, like these young men standing on this ladder, making the drawings on either side, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. The program in landscape architecture here at UPenn was founded in 1924 with the appointment of Robert Wheelwright as its first chair by the Dean of the School of Fine Arts, Warren Powers Laird. Wheelwright was a founding member of the American Society of Landscape Architects, co-founder and editor of the journal Landscape Architecture, and a prominent landscape architect in New York and Philadelphia. Wheelwright served as chair until 1942 when he enrolled in the draft. The program was suspended during World War II and then reestablished as an undergraduate and then a graduate landscape architecture program in the new Department of Land and City Planning in 1951 with the arrival of a new dean, G. Holmes Perkins. In 1954, Perkins invited Ian McHarg to UPenn to start a new graduate program, and McHarg would officially become the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture in 1957, serving through 1986. He was succeeded by Anne Whiston Spirn, whom we are delighted to welcome today as the opening keynote speaker of this symposium. Spirn served as chair from 1986 through 1994. A 1974 graduate of the program, Spirn also became a close collaborator at McHarg's professional office, WMRT, Wallace, McHarg's, Roberts, and Todd. We're also thrilled to welcome 9 guest speakers who will join us with our faculty as part of this afternoon's symposium. And finally, we're excited also to host a closing talk by the climate writer, Jeff Goodell. Ian McHarg's multi-year study of the Delaware River Basin began in 1967 and continued for almost 25 years. In 1969, he published his groundbreaking Design with Nature, the massively influential book that both describes and prescribes a design practice rooted in ecological systems. McHarg brought the program out into the region, but also, I would argue, into the space age. McHarg's method of layering environmental data in maps was intended to help designers understand existing natural conditions and inform design decisions. Here we see an image of Staten Island, drawn from the book Design with Nature. And 50 years later, on the right, a photograph of inventive species thriving on the capped landfill of Fresh Kills Park, a site that our former chair, Jim Corner, has been working on for 20 years. The department is founded on the principles of ecology, anchoring landscape architecture squarely within the earth sciences. The word ecology has its roots in the Greek oikologia, translated literally as the household of nature, thus bringing home the everyday and entangled relationships between humans, plants, animals, and the mineral world. Yet our understanding of ecology has evolved rapidly over the past century. Our department studies urban ecologies, material ecologies, and social ecologies, while reassessing our impact on both the planet and each other as we address the climate crisis. We've rethought earlier ecological theories of successional progression to a steady climate state. Today, landscape architects consider the complex and messy conditions of resilience, disturbance, and indeterminacy, heightened by the social and environmental necessities of reparative justice and decarbonization. At Penn, our landscape architecture students and faculty are engaged in new and collaborative, powerful ways of thinking and researching, nimbly moving across scales from high-altitude observations of the astronaut to the attentive fieldwork of the naturalist. We engage in multiplicities and complexities and embrace novel strategies for reimagining future ecological relationships through the lens of social, environmental, and multi-species justice. We are designing the world we want to inhabit, advancing both the landscape profession and the discipline, and we look to the future with optimism. In 1924, we looked at the moon through Felix the cat. In 1969, we looked back at the Earth through the lens of Michael Collins, capturing the Apollo 11 lunar module, the moon, and the Earth, all living beings except for himself. That same year, Ian McHarg published Design with Nature. And in 2024, the Chandra Telescope celebrated its 25th anniversary, and we looked at the Cassiopeia A supernova remnant, an expanding ball of matter and energy ejected from an exploding star. On the 50th anniversary of the publication of Design with Nature, the Weitzman School of Design launched the Ian L. McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology with a symposium and publication of the new book, Design with Nature Now. Housed in the Department of Landscape Architecture, the McHarg Center is a transdisciplinary platform for design and planning research that supports the future of life on Earth. The center funds and broadcasts original scholarly research, convenes students and practitioners, and awards the annual McHarg Fellowship. We're grateful to the leadership of our advisory board, led by our board chair, Cindy Sanders, whom we just met with this morning. And I'd especially like to thank Henry Meyerberg, Joy Sand Presley, OLIN, and Landscape Forms for their sponsorship of this Centennial event. 100 years, much has transpired in the department and the discipline and in the world, but we remain fully convinced that the Earth is the best planet, and we look forward to continuing our conversations today and into the next century of elastic scalar thinking and design. I'd like to now welcome the chair of the McHarg Center Board, Cindy Sanders, to the stage to introduce our speaker, Anne Spirn.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Okay, so for anybody who knows me, my line of thinking, you'll absolutely know my fondness for uncovering the story behind the story, not just of landscapes, but of leadership. The fibers of leadership, of the self or otherwise, are often left unexplored. We might even say that this is especially true in academia, where we believe the engine of success seems to lie entirely above our shoulders. When I wrote my dissertation on transformational leadership over 6 years ago now, I identified over 20 people who I thought most embodied the principles of transformational leadership. That is, people who sought to bring about change for the greater good. Unsurprisingly, Anne Whiston Spirn was one of my interviewees. When we look at Anne's CV, we see an extraordinarily polished and accomplished professional and academic. WMRT, Harvard, Penn, MIT, numerous publications, and a sought-after speaker. But what we don't see are the dilemmas, discomfort, or challenges along the way. We don't see the dogged determination, or the steely resolve needed in order to keep pushing through when that person is 100 steps ahead of everybody else, or when that person is a woman forging her way in a very male world of the 70s and 80s. In this brief introduction, I think somewhat most appropriately, I'm seeking to uncover, reveal, and even celebrate the beauty and wisdom of some of the hidden valley bottoms and rivers of Anne Whiston Spirn. Anne is a role model of transformational leadership, not merely for what she has accomplished, but also for the very best in what it means to be human and how she has shown up in this world. So let's take a peek. Anne had a hunch and dared to ask why not. So in the early 70s, while at Penn, this young student and her colleagues who were working on mostly greenfield projects at the time, all in support of developing the method, said to Ian McHarg, "Why don't we have any urban studios?" To which this giant personality boomed back, "Because we don't know enough. There's no information about the urban natural environment, so we can't do urban ecological design." This assuredness surely would have dampened the spirit of many, but not Anne. After working on the Toronto project in the mid-70s, Anne discovered Ian's proclamation simply wasn't true. She told me at that moment I was determined to write a book. Anne had a big vision and listened to those outside the choir. So in the first meeting with her editor, her soon-to-be editor, the editor queried Anne about the topic of her book and why she was writing it. Anne answered, "It's about nature in the city and how differently we would design and build cities if only we thought of cities as part of the natural world. I want to change the way cities are designed and built." "And who is your audience?" the editor asked. "Architects, landscape architects, urban designers, and urban planners." Anne told me, she looked at me like I was crazy and said, "What? Do you think they control the way the city is designed and built? What about developers? What about politicians? What about journalists? And what about ordinary people?" The editor went on to tell Anne that she was not interested in a book that is for that narrow of an audience. "But if you should ever change your mind about the audience, send me a book proposal." Some might have taken that as an outright rejection of an ambition and retreated. Not Anne. Instead, Anne looked at her quizzically and said, "What's a book proposal?" After assiduously taking copious notes on the topic of a book proposal, she thought about the wisdom that had been imparted to her, and after a few months, she wrote that proposal for what was to become the Granite Garden, published in 1984. So Anne embarked on something she had never done before. It was indeed her editor who convinced Anne that if you really want to change, choose your audience and speak to that audience. But up to that moment, Anne's world consisted of the likes of writing guidelines and reports, like for the Woodlands at WMRT. With this new and expanded audience in mind, Anne had to learn to fine-tune her voice and to speak to a dual audience. She told me she learned that you have to have epiphanies for your expert readers, and you have to speak in understandable and compelling language to ordinary, intelligent people. In short order, Anne mastered that because 3 years later, in 1984, the very week of publication, she was launched onto the international stage with a review in the New York Times Book Review, followed by the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor. She was on her way to reaching audiences that were not her own, including interdisciplinary academic and professional audiences, geographers, historians, and politicians, to name a few. Anne was already making an impact because she dared to take that leap into a space that was quite unfamiliar. Anne insisted and stood firmly. When I asked Anne about the future she was trying to bring about, she replied, "It was really forged in a concern for improving the natural environment, at the same time improving conditions in communities on the margins of poverty and race." And well, that certainly was present from the very early days, I would say grade school days. It became particularly acute during the time I was writing the Granite Garden. And so I had this vision that I didn't think environmental issues should be competing with social economic issues for the same funds. And environmental causes were often being pitted against social justice causes for funding. But it was my insistence, just absolute insistence on my part, that those be brought together. Yet it's imperative that we remind ourselves of the context here. Anne reflected back on her days while a student at Penn, saying, "I got a lot of grief from my friends who were politically organizing around resistance to the Vietnam War. They saw this as a cop-out to be concerned about issues of the environment. And this was before the environmental justice movement, so it wasn't exactly a hot topic among most of my classmates at Penn to be concerned about issues of race and poverty." Anne is a maverick. Along the way, Anne found a three-legged stool. So there was this plethora of recognition swirling around Anne's research-based academic practice, with her work in Dorchester and Roxbury when she was at Harvard. She had write-ups in the Boston Globe, political recognition from the governor's cabinet, nonprofit recognition, and public and community appreciation and accolades. But there was this uncomfortable aura. After the Granite Garden was released, an editor from the publishing company asked Anne, "What are your colleagues saying?" And Anne said, "Well, it's really odd. They're saying nothing." To which the editor quipped, "Oh, good, good." Anne wanted to know what on earth she meant. She said, "Anne, that means it's really good. If they're not saying anything, that means it's really good. I've seen this all the time. It's one thing to be the little princess. It's another thing to be the queen." And then, after arriving at Penn in 1986, and still somewhat disoriented by the silence from her colleagues, Anne invited a highly admired water engineer from Denver to Penn to lecture. She told me that after the lecture, she took him on a tour of Mill Creek, up the buried floodplain and the watershed, and said, "Ken, tell me, are my ideas, are these crazy?" And he said, "Anne, no, this is really exciting. I don't know anyone anywhere doing this. Just keep going. You've got something there." I would be remiss if I did not mention the third leg of that stool, stabilizing Anne when the silence of the doubters became deafening. I need to note Anne's husband, who appeared on the screen during this interview, delivering flowers for what I think was their anniversary. He seemed to always be full of admiration and would dispense useful perspectives, such as, "Anne, never underestimate the insecure male." And finally, Anne is a connector and embodied boundless patience. The timeline is way too extensive for this introduction, but let's just say there was a lot of water that passed between the time the Granite Garden hit the stands, Anne's work in the communities of Boston, the Mill Creek Project, meetings with the EPA, and the publication in 2009 of PWD's Green City Clean Waters. Even after Anne left for MIT, she made herself available for consultations and presentations with people and former students in Philadelphia who had become her friends. On reflection, Anne said, "I think that I thought I was going to transform the world with the Granite Garden. And even though it got so much immediate recognition, it just seems like it took so long." If you look back at the 80s and 90s, those ideas, it took so long for those ideas to become mainstream. It's really hard to change culture overnight. That's why I think transformational change requires both impatience and patience. It requires determination to continue to persist. Please welcome to the stage the full complexity of our brilliant, patient, determined, courageous maverick and queen, Anne Whiston Spirn.
Wow, Cindy, thank you. And thank you for your welcome. I think I can go home now. Seriously, this is really a wonderful occasion to be here and an honor to give some personal reflections on this momentous occasion of the 100th anniversary of this beloved department. So my talk today is going to be a personal reflection of the time in which I've been engaged more directly with the Department of Landscape Architecture. But I hope that my reflections will prompt each of you to reflect on your own experience. As I reflect on how our education here at Penn has influenced your own career. I think we all probably can remember the first time we heard of Ian McHarg. And I was a senior in college at Harvard, and I was studying art history, and I had applied for PhD programs in art history. And then the spring of my senior year, on the 9th of March, 1969, I saw this film, Multiply and Subdue the Earth. And it was fascinating. I really thought, wow, this guy's really interesting. And what he's talking about is really interesting, but he's an ecologist. I don't want to be an ecologist. Look at that. He didn't identify himself as a landscape architect. So I arrived here in Meyerson Hall when the art history department was down on the ground floor to do my first year of graduate study in the art history department. And I went to the bookstore, and there was a big shelf of faculty authors' new books. And what do I see but this book, Design with Nature? And then I realized that this guy that had been in the film that I'd seen on TV just a few months before was at Penn. And not only that, he wasn't an ecologist, he was something called a landscape architect. And my roommate was majoring in architecture and getting her MArch. And I opened her catalog and read the description of landscape architecture and regional planning. And I said, wow, this is describing me. I had never heard of landscape architecture before, but this is describing me. So I decided to go in and talk to Ian McHarg. This is 3 weeks into the semester. And surprisingly enough, I waltzed right into his office. It turns out it was Yom Kippur, and Lenore Sagan was not there. So those of you who know Lenore know that I wouldn't so easily have waltzed into Ian's office. And McHarg started, yes, why don't you just start next week? Now, I had a 4-year fellowship, doctoral fellowship in art history, and McHarg and Ian said, yes, well, we'll just take that fellowship right into, landscape art. And I said, I don't think that works that way. But anyways, so I put off the time. Oh, by the way, I met my husband that same night. How about that? Ian McHarg and my husband in the same night. So I know you probably all can remember your first week of school, maybe your first day arriving at Meyerson Hall, and there's the Furnace Library. And I was nervous. I guess we all were nervous. And we walked in, and these walls, in this exact room, the walls were covered with these maps. More than you see up here in the upper gallery or down here now. But it was extraordinary. It was overwhelming. And Narendra Janeja was the master of ceremonies, and he walked us around looking at these maps, and I was completely overwhelmed. I didn't understand practically anything he was saying, and I despaired of ever being able to interpret these maps. But it was just quite an extraordinary experience. Now, I think this is this DRB 1 or 2? I don't remember. I was asking Elliot Roadside, who participated in this, Delaware River Basin. So this is the Delaware River Basin. And the beauty of this conception of the curriculum in the first year is that you studied the Delaware River Basin within the context of physiographic regions. So there was the Pocono Plateau, the Ridgeon Valley, the Great Valley, Piedmont Upland, Piedmont Lowland, the Coastal Plain, and Ocean and Bay. And there were maps. So each of us were in teams representing one of those physiographic regions within the larger Delaware River Basin. I think we were DRP 4, maybe it was 5. I asked several of my classmates, and they couldn't remember which DRB we were. But there was a whole sequence, so we were doing DRBs every year for a number of years. The first week of school, we were taken out in buses, a bus and cars, to do 2 days worth of traveling from the Pocono Plateau all the way down to Ocean and Bay. And with us were all of the faculty, among them professors of geology, ecology, soils, wildlife, and they interpreted this landscape for us at each stop in each of these physiographic regions. So this was also just an extraordinary experience. I remember driving with a couple of the faculty. I remember we had a bus, but there were also some cars. And we were driving down the road, and this faculty member was pointing out, oh, that's an oak, that's a maple, and I thought, how can he possibly see, driving along the road, identify these tree species? But of course, that's something that we were entered into the mysteries of field work and understanding of how natural processes shape the landscapes of the river basin and the physiographic region. Now, it was rather odd. I arrived in 1970, and our class was in landscape architecture, took up the whole third floor west mezzanine in Meyerson. And down below on the second floor was a sea of regional planners. But there were only 3 final year students, and there were only 1 second year, 3-year student. So where did all the students go? We're the first year students. We must have been about, I don't know, 25 or 30 or so. But there was this tiny handful of more senior students. Now, the story was that Ian had decided when Ian did something, he often went whole hog. And apparently, the previous year, according to what we were told, was that he had introduced computing and that the students spent the entire semester digitizing, and they left. This isn't one of the work of the 501 class. This is actually a computer app done by students as a thesis project that graduated just before I arrived. So Ian, what an incredible mentor. And as Cindy mentioned, I was fortunate enough to study under him and also work with him in the office. But Ian had such a tremendous influence on all of us, I think. One thing that I've said, oh, by the way, I have to add this. This photograph, I believe, was taken by Becky Young around the time of Ian's 50th birthday. And Ian's 50th birthday was in November of my first year in 501. And so several of us decided to bake a birthday cake for him in the shape of the Delaware River Basin with topographic relief going from Pocono Plateau through the Rigid Valley all the way down to Ocean. And we had a chocolate icing on it, and we put candles on each of our sites. And it was a big surprise. It was a big surprise. Of course, in the happy hours, the faculty, we were served beer, and the faculty all drank gin and tonics. Or martinis, I guess it was. Anyways, I have to say, Ian McHarg's essay, An Ecological Method for Landscape Architecture of 1967, if you haven't read it, read it. It's really, I think, required reading for all landscape architects. One of my favorite quotes is, "Every place is in the process of becoming. This we must be able to read, and ecology provides the language." Well, I'm sorry to say that I'm a bit mortified to admit this, but I have said this so many times without citation, that every place is in the process of becoming, that when I went back to read the article again a few years ago and I saw this phrase, oh no, I didn't write this is really Ian's, but it became so embedded. I mean, it was just so formative, this notion of the changing landscape. Later, I would go to teach at Harvard, and when Pete Walker was chairman, and it was all about moving shapes around. You know, there was never a mention of process and the relation of process and form, and not really talking about change either. So this was really important. But I would say ecology is not the only subject that provides the language. Bob Giengak was such an inspiring teacher. Really, he's a geomorphologist, and he had a 25% appointment in our department. Gig was such a great teacher. He really inspired me to want to learn to read landscapes, shape, and structure as an expression of geology. And another quote from Ian from the same article Written on the place and on its inhabitants lies mute all physical, biological, and cultural history, awaiting to be understood by those who can read it. This is prerequisite for intelligent intervention and adaptation. So this notion of adaptation was also central to what we were learning about our role as designers and planners was to adapt, to adapt landscapes to natural and social processes. So it's not strange that McHarg, when he decided to bring in the social sciences into the department as well as the natural sciences, that he turned to Yehudi Cohen, who was an anthropologist teaching at Rutgers University at the time. And you could see this series of books that he wrote, Man in Adaptation. Yehudi was teaching at Rutgers, but he came to give a lecture course for my first year in 501 in the spring, when the fall was natural processes and the spring was social processes. And what Yehudi did was he also supervised a group of graduate students, PhD students in anthropology here at Penn, to be TAs for each of our teams in each of those physiographic regions. And now we were working in a community within the area that we'd studied from the perspective of the natural processes. So we learned ethnographic methods. Design anthropology now is a coming field, but Ian had anticipated this decades before. And after Yehudi, and then later David and Vera Mae Fredrickson from Berkeley did their anthropologists who did their sabbatical here the following year, he managed to hire Seth Lowe and Dan Rose as full-time anthropologists in our department. Another quote, form and process are indivisible aspects of a single phenomenon, which makes it possible to understand form as an explicit point in evolutionary process. Bob Hanna, also a really important figure in my own education, was taught a course my first year in form and process. I don't know how many years after that he taught it, but it was really, I think everyone in our class felt it was a formative course. Bob also, I learned, was not, I don't know if he wasn't able to or whether he just did it in order to make us draw, but it seemed like he didn't take in a desk crit, verbal interchange. You had to draw, it had to be drawn. And so I'd grown up in a verbal family, and I'd learned to kind of get along with words. And it's ironic because I'm known for the books I've written, but actually I'm a visual thinker. And Bob Hanna introduced me to my native language. I didn't know there was such a thing as visual thinking, really, in terms of working out actions. He taught me diagramming. And so then we could have a conversation using diagrams. That was, it was so liberating for me. Peter Shepard. Peter was a beloved teacher. And one thing I learned from him, you always wanted Peter in a studio review to be the first one to speak, because he always said something appreciative about your design. And so you kind of relaxed. Okay, Peter understands me. He understands what I'm trying to do. And then zing, came the criticism. But what's the lesson in this? You start with a compliment, something that's really working in the student's design. They relax, they become open to criticism, because of course this person understands what they're trying to do, so they're just going to try to help you. I've tried to do that in my own teaching, and I have come to learn how difficult that is sometimes. It's really hard. I'm sitting there, okay, Anne, yeah, what can I find in this wrong-headed design to start out and say something positive? But I always manage somehow. Also, those of you who were around at that time will know Peter gave a legendary series of lectures. One was on light, one was on water. I think there were 6 altogether, and he would give them every year when he was here, so everyone got a chance to see them. One thing I did when I came back as chair of the department, I asked Peter to give those. He hadn't given the lectures for years, and I asked if he would give them again. And we videotaped them. Now, I don't know where do we have that? Good, okay, great. These lectures that he gave on various design phenomena and phenomena like water and light as media were all illustrated by his own photographs, which were really wonderful. I had come into landscape architecture originally to support myself as a photographer, so I was keenly interested in his photography, and he gave a talk to us once in the studio and pulled out of his pocket this little mini Raleigh camera, 35 millimeter Raleigh camera, which he said he bought because he could carry it in his pocket and have it with him always. And so fairly early on, when I got a job and was earning money, I bought a 35 Raleigh, just like Peter's. I hope you can appreciate how all these mentors' ideas are ways of working influenced my book, The Language of Landscape. It is inconceivable that I could have written this book without their teaching. Now, John Collins was also an influential teacher, an inspiring mentor. He taught plants and design. But what I took away from it was not so much his love of plants and his knowledge of plants, but the fact that he in his own work, he took on the job of maintaining the landscapes he designed. So he worked for the city of Salem for many years in Massachusetts. And whenever he went up for a clients meeting, he took his pruning shears and would go out and, prune the plants, because he knew that funds for landscape maintenance were often slim. He also, one thing I really found inspiring was not just his commitment to maintaining the landscapes he had designed, but also at his own expense, without pay, he designed and taught a course in landscape maintenance at a prison here in Philadelphia. And after the graduates of his program were released from prison, he gave them jobs, maintaining the landscape along the Schuylkill River, which he designed, and also the place you see here, which is now called John F. Collins Park, which is on the 1700 block of Chestnut Street. Many of you may have seen it. He and or his former prisoners could be seen here taking care of this park. He had a closet in Collins and Duteau in the firm's office that was full of mowers and pruning shears and all kinds of gardening equipment for the ex-prisoners to come and pick up the tools and go out. Now, field work was incredibly important, and we had the great advantage of having these faculty members who could come out into the field with us and help us see it, help us see landscape as the result of the processes that were shaping it. However, as Cindy already said, as you could see, they were always rural sites. The one exception was the urban garden. That was one out of all the out of all the studio sites that we had that was urban, and that was only half a semester. The others were all rural. So there were a group of us that were rabble-rousers, and we confronted McHarg and asked him for a meeting where we basically said, what about the city? And as Cindy said, his response was, we don't know enough about the city to do ecological design. So one classmate of mine, Heidi Cook, and I decided to take Dave Wallace's urban design studio, fall of our third year. And Wallace, of course, was a partner of Ian's at Wallace McHarg, Robertson Todd. So Heidi and I went up for the first meeting of studio in the fall, and we walked into Dave Wallace's studio and got permission to take the studio. And we were sitting there, and then about 15 minutes after the studio had started, Ian comes storming into the room, looks around, sees Heidi and me, hauls us up by the scruff of our necks, figuratively, and tells us in no uncertain terms, we are not taking Dave Wallace's studio. We need to join him downstairs in the landscape architecture studio. So that was that. The result was that the studio was the Woodlands in Woodlands, Texas, which was a project at the same time in the office, taught by Ian McHarg and Colin Franklin, who was at the time project director for the Woodlands project in the office. And we were told that, after all it had been drummed into us how important field work was, we were told there was no money for us to go to Houston. So Heidi, already furious about being hauled out of Dave Wallace's studio, said, I'm leaving. So she took a year's leave. I ended up staying in the studio, and that had an unexpected result because in the course of doing the studio, Anne Moss and I, who were working together on the project, decided that we would interview people on the Penn campus, staff and students who were from the Houston area, so that we could do our ethnographic work. And of course, Ian loved that. So at the end of the semester, Heidi and I wanted to do our thesis work together, but she had taken a year off. So I said, okay, I'll take a year off starting in January. And I approached Ian about a job, and he said, sure. So he hired me, and my life could have been very much different had I not taken that year off and worked on the Woodlands project. It was really extraordinary, and I think one of the gifts of working in the office was seeing how intimate the relationship was between the university and the office, and how essentially the office in a way was an outpost of the university. Most people today, when you look at the iconic jobs that we had in the office at the time, the Woodlands, Sanibel, Toronto, might have thought that we were a large office, but there were only a few of us working on these jobs. We were all Penn alums working with Ian, and we had the wonderful, really, it was such a luxury. We had a geologist who was also a regional planning graduate, Richard Nalbandian, and we had Leslie Sauer, who was acting as an ecologist, and then later, after Leslie left, Carol Rife-Snyder, also a graduate of the regional planning program. And they were consultants in the office. You could go downstairs and talk to Richard, talk to Leslie or Carol, and that was extraordinary. But then working on the jobs, there would only maybe be very few people, maybe 2 people, 3 people working on some of these large projects. On Sanibel, there were, the Sanibel plant is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And it was Bill Roberts, partner in charge, John Sutton, associate partner in charge, me working on the ecological side of the planning, and I think Beth Kitchen working on the social and economic. That was it. It was kind of lean and mean. as I said, I realized how closely tied that the university was to the office, that things were being explored in the university and then applied in the office. And I had heard about Toby Turbier and Richard Westmacott's work on stormwater management throughout my whole time as a student in the department. And here you see something, it's a publication from 1981, but we all knew in the early 70s about their work. And so the Woodlands was really, in a way, an application of some of these ideas that had been floating around the department. And Toby and Richard were students, so the sense that students could really make a difference. In Design with Nature, Ian wrote, a professional landscape architect or city planner is limited in the projects he undertakes to problems presented by his clients. A professor, in contrast, suffers no such constraints and is enabled to undertake projects he deems worthy of study. That's one reason why I've stayed in academia and not tried to establish a professional office, but to use my university salary to support work that I probably couldn't find a client for. So let's take a look at how this works and use Design with Nature as an example. So in Design with Nature, there are certain chapters where the university are about case studies in the university. Here you see, if you look at the contents to Design with Nature, you see 3 chapters that feature projects that were solely conducted in studios in the university. And then in the office, which you see here in blue, there are 3 different chapters that feature case studies that were done in the professional office of Wallace McHarg. And here in the purple, you see 2 projects, 2 chapters that feature work that was done in both, in this interchange between the university and practice. Now, I want to stop here for a minute and give a tribute to Narendra Juneja. Here they are. This was taken from Life magazine. McHarg and Narendra Juneja at La Terrasse, or it was called the Moravian then, I think, on Sansom Street with their martinis. This was celebrating an article about the book in Life magazine. But I want you to, it's no coincidence that it's Narendra that's here with Ian. I want you to take a look at the dedication to Design with Nature. It's dedicated to Ian's family, but then to those who helped bring it into being. Russell Train and the Conservation Foundation, Louis Mumford, Narendra Juneja, and Eugene Feldman. Now, Narendra had not been that influential on me as a student, but he became enormously influential working with him in the office. We worked together on environmental resources of the Toronto Central Waterfront, which Cindy referred to as the discovery. Yes, we know a lot about the natural environment of the city, but Narendra was brilliant in terms of thinking about the process of mapping and analyzing landscape in ways that revealed new knowledge. And we did a series of maps: air, earth, water, life, wildlife, and plants, and using the legend as a storyline, connecting it back to the map. When we took this map to Toronto, and the scientists that had contributed the information that we synthesized in these maps that we made, series of maps, they were astonished. They would go up to the map and say, "Oh, that's why that's happening," etc. So obviously then what follows is the Granite Garden in 1984. I have to talk a little bit about Partisan, which was a plan for an environmental park in Tehran, Iran, during the time that the Shah was still in reign in 1975. It was a wonderful project conceptually. The point of the project was to demonstrate the theme of adaptation of plants, animals, and human cultures to biomes of the world, bioclimatic zones. And it was an education putting together the program. We worked for an entire summer on the program, and then for a year on the design, which is, as you see here. The next phase, of course, was construction, and Narendra Janeja was persuaded by Ian to go to Tehran and open an office there on site. And there was a project director that would go with him. And then I was supposed to be the project director here in Philadelphia in the office. I had real misgivings about this. It had been a very exciting project to do conceptually, but I remember having conversations with Richard Nalbandian, for example, the geologist and planner, about the ethics of the water use and what the water budget would have to be to recreate all the biomes of the world in this desert. And when my husband decided that he was going to switch into radiology and was going to go to a residency in Boston, I said, yes, let me out of here, because I couldn't say no to Ian. And it was a tragic project, because it, as you know, the Shah fell, and Ian, Narendra came home and shortly thereafter died of a heart attack. And it was a very stressful time in Iran for him. The partners really didn't want to go on to this next phase of Partisan because they'd had problems getting paid all along, and they were really worried about spending so much money up front to establish an office. And so, but Ian really wanted this. It was going to be one of the 7 wonders of the world, and to demonstrate his ideas about adaptation and design. And so he agreed to sign a personal responsibility for the financing if the money didn't come through. And the Shah fell, and the money didn't come. And so Ian lost his office. It became Wallace Robertson Todd, WRT. He lost his office. He lost Narendra Janeja, his key right hand, at the same time. Well, this practice of research is one that has been alive and well in the department. It wasn't just Wallace McHarg, Robertson Todd, it was also Andropogon. Here you see the founders of Andropogon, Leslie and Rolf Sauer, Carol and Colin Franklin at the Arboretum. A lot of their work, especially in the early years, was very innovative and full of trying things out and doing research and trying things out. And then, of course, there was a practice of research with Penn and Hannah Olin. Both Laurie had come in as a faculty member after I had left. When Peter Shepard became dean, he persuaded the university to take a look at its landscape. It was really a mess. It really was a mess. My heart sank when I came down to look at Penn and realized I was going to go to this place with this, Blanche Levy Park, the college green here was just a bunch of dirt and kind of trails through it. It was not at all attractive. So Peter persuaded Leslie and Rolf and Carol and Colin and Bob and Laurie to get together and do this landscape development plan, which is a really important plan. I would recommend taking a look at it. It's a rare document now, but it's very interesting. And here's a sketch from that Peter Shepard did of the transformation, and here it is today. So our landscape in Blanche Levy Park, right outside, is really a tribute to Peter Shepard and to those faculty members who worked together. It wasn't always easy for the Andropogon guys and the Hannah Olin guys to work together, but they did. So I was recruited by Dean Lee Copeland when, in 1986, to take on the chairmanship of the department after Ian was persuaded, I think, to step down as chair. And imagine this coming back, let's see, 12 years after you graduated and chairman of a department where all your faculty are still there, except for Narendra. It was really something, but Ian was really super, super helpful. And, kind of said, give me my marching orders. I'm a good sergeant. Now, he did take a sabbatical my first year, which was also very gracious. I thought I was being pretty clever negotiating with Lee Copeland. I said, I want to see the budget before I will agree. And so he showed me the budget, and I said, oh, okay, I can work within this, but you have to promise that it's not going to be reduced. He said, okay. I also negotiated for an extra faculty line because imagine this, there were, at this point, the faculty was entirely natural, the standing faculty was entirely natural and social sciences, scientists, and the only 2 full-time landscape architecture faculty members were myself and Ian, and Bob Hanna and Tony Wamsley, who were both professors, were half-time. So we were running the landscape architecture curriculum basically on visiting lecturers. And then, guess what? I agreed to come, and then Lee Copeland tells me, by the way, the department is $200,000 in the red. And that's over $500,000 in 2024 values. So obviously we're not going to get an increase in budget. Also, when I came, there were only 3 incoming regional planning students. And in the past, there'd been almost a majority of regional planning students. So where did all the students go? And also, we had very few landscape architecture students. So in a budget situation where our budget was determined by tuition, this was thus the red. I think I was talking to Fritz about where all the MRP students had gone in 1986. I think probably because of Reaganomics. Reagan, a lot of the RP graduates had gone to public agencies and to EPA. So I knew how to recruit landscape architecture students, though. So I worked hard on that. And the first year, everyone accepted into the department got a signed copy, paperback copy of the Granite Garden. Alan Berger is now a colleague of mine at MIT. So I said, hey, Alan, do you still have the copy? And so he took this photograph of me. For Alan Berger, hope to see you in September. Best wishes. Anne Whiston Spirn, 30 March, 1987. We got a huge acceptance rate that year. Harvard didn't know what had happened to them. They were our major competitor and usually beat us, and except for foreign students, because they didn't give foreign students any financial aid. And we did. So also, given that there were so few landscape architecture faculty, I recruited visitors like Larry Halpern. I got to know Larry, and we had a whole series. I met him at University of California, Berkeley anniversary celebration symposium, much like this, and started talking to Larry to try to persuade him to come and teach at Penn. He said no. I said, well, what if you came and ran a workshop? No. I need people's full attention. You're just going to squeeze me in between classes. I said, no, I'll call off classes. If you come for 2 days, we'll call off all classes. They're yours. No, you wouldn't. Yes. So he came. And it was great. And then I said, how about a studio? So he had a good time. And he said, I don't know how I could possibly do a studio. And then I got a call from him a few months later, and he said, Anne, I have an idea. I have this client who called me and wants me to do a project in Pennsylvania. It's too small for me to take on. However, what if we had a studio and with like 6 students, and what they could do, I would come out 3 times, once at the beginning to take them to the site and do a workshop on the site, once in the middle to see their progress, and once at the end for the review. Meanwhile, one of the students should be appointed job captain, and every week ship off all the drawings done that week, FedEx, to San Francisco, and then have a phone conversation with me every Friday. So that's what they did. And Larry, at the end of the review of that studio, announced that he was giving his archives to Penn. Now, there's a longer story there too, as you can imagine, but that was really, that was amazing. I have to admit, I said to him, Larry, I think that your archive belongs in the Bay Area. You should really think about Berkeley. He said, nope, it's not going to Berkeley. It's not going to Berkeley. The archive people in the library there don't touch it, folks. I want my archive to be open. So he said, but Harvard is interested, and I'm talking to them. I said, okay, let's talk. As you know, we got it. Larry also said something to me, oh, and by the way, yep, here it is on the wall. We have these beautiful drawings, and not only that, we have the journals. It's amazing. The other really wise thing that Larry said to me was, landscape architects have a inferiority complex with architecture. They don't know how to design buildings, and you should have a studio where students in landscape architecture can have a housing design. He said, but the most important thing is it just shouldn't be anybody teaching that housing studio. It should be a master architect. So about that time, I met Glenn Murcutt, who now is a Pritzker Prize winner. At the time, he had won, I think, the Alto Medal, but had not been as much recognized as he is today. And I persuaded Glenn to come. I had to invent a 3-week studio because he could only come for 3 weeks. But then it seemed, hey, this could work. We'll have 4 3-week studios and get people from all around the world and all around the country. And that's what we did. The great thing was that the architecture students started lining up outside my office to be able to be admitted into Glenn Murcutt's studio. At that time, the architects would not admit landscape architecture students into their studios. So we did a deal. We admitted 3 architecture students into the studio. And the landscape architecture students really came out on top in the designs because Glenn demanded that they pay attention to natural processes. So another thing in terms of renewal, we finally got some more lines in faculty lines, and Jim Corner was hired Jim, and then Anu applied after she had graduated and gone to work for Peter Walker's SWA group for a few years, applied for a position, and thankfully we recruited her. And I just want to say how sad I am that she's not here. She is sorely, sorely, sorely missed. So Jim and Anu came in as assistant professors. We hired Dana Tomlin as a full professor because he was already a legendary figure in GIS at that time. It was great. I went to a meeting with some engineering professors on the same committee, and they looked at me and said, I can't believe you have Dana Tomlin on the landscape architecture faculty. He's a legendary figure. So since 1987, I started the West Philadelphia Landscape Project as a laboratory for generating, exploring, and testing models for restoring urban nature and rebuilding low-income communities. Exploring, and maybe some of you here today were research assistants on this project. In search of the buried river, we've been mapping the Mill Creek watershed for years now. I'm running out of time, so I won't tell you any stories about this, but just to note it. Some others of you may have worked on the early years of the project. building community gardens, designing community gardens, and developing plans for the larger watershed. In 1996, I gave my first studio that was all online. All the student work was posted online, available to the public, including engineers at the Philadelphia Water Department. And this is just one example of some of the work that was done. We put together the engineering course with my studio so that it was really, the grading had been done and the drainage had been done and detailed. In 1999, some engineers at the water department called me up and said, Anne, would you take us on a tour and show us what you're talking about? And this Mill Creek and detaining stormwater detention to reduce combined sewer overflows. So we went out and historic maps in hand, walked and drove the Mill Creek buried floodplain. At the end of the afternoon, we went to La Terrasse and had some beers. And at that point, the engineers decided to start a demonstration, apply for grants to do a demonstration project, which they did do. And in 2009, as many of you know, they published Green City Clean Water's proposal to reduce the city's combined sewer overflow through green infrastructure. I moved to MIT in 2000, and since then I've done action research and classes at MIT here, working with the water department, working with the same community I've been working with since 1987, and now looking at issues around green infrastructure and green gentrification, helping people who are being displaced here in West Philadelphia, low-income homeowners, hang on to their homes. Just this past spring, I taught a course working with a school, middle school at 46th and Haverford Avenue. Two of my students' projects was a series of posters, which you see one of the 8th graders posting here. Wherever there was a telephone pole, whether there was a sign, we buy houses, they put up posters saying they buy homes. And then there's a QR code where you can link into the QR code and get all kinds of information about how to avoid displacement. Then another of there were 6 different posters they designed. Here's one that I love, Body of Water Below. Say, you are standing on the Deganassi/Mill Creek. And these were to be posted all along the buried buried floodplain. So I am the product of this department. I hope that that's come through. My career and contributions would be inconceivable without the ideas, methods, and skills that I learned here, without the wisdom and generosity of teachers like Ian, Peter Shepard, Narendra, Bob Hanna, John Collins, and Bob Giegengak, and without the experience of the practice of research in McHarg's office and its intimate connection to the university. Many of you are also products of this department, and we embody its legacy. I hope that my reflections have prompted your own memories and inspired you to reflect on how this department has shaped your career and contributions in the present and looking to the future. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the department asked alums to record such reflections and compile them into a document? That would be a document worthy of our 100th anniversary. Thank you.
After I finish at community college, I'll be looking to transfer to continue my education. And my question to you is, what are some of the differences between architecture and landscape architecture, and why is landscape architecture important?
Wow. Well, get me started. I think the The wonderful thing about landscape architecture is we span scales from the design of a garden to a larger region, does plans for a larger region. We're essentially a bridge between architecture and city planning. You know, city planners tend to work at a larger citywide scale, and architects tend to work at the scale of a building or complex of buildings, or the urban design approach they may take is what I would call more formal. They see the buildings as the most important part of the urban design plan, whereas a landscape architect looking at urban design will focus not just on buildings, but also the spaces between buildings and how they're used. I think, you know, for your future education, it really depends on what your passion is. You know, for me, I was never interested in designing buildings, but I loved landscape. I studied art history, and what did I study? Landscape paintings. I did photography, and what did I like to photograph? Landscapes. So I have a passion for landscape. And if you're interested in issues around the huge environmental crisis that faces us with climate change, I think landscape architecture is well placed to work in that arena towards solutions. Does that answer your question? But you know what's most important is if you want to go on with your education to Penn or MIT or Rutgers or, you know, wherever, it's you should the different universities have very different programs in landscape architecture and architecture. If you're interested in social justice issues, there's certain departments that are really focused on that. If you're interested in ecological issues, there are departments that are really focused on that. And hopefully there are also universities that do both. But it's really a matter of just educating yourself about what's out there. Another question? Yep.
I was standing near the mic, so I got the mic. Hi, Anne. I'm Jennifer Root from Landscape Architecture
Hi,
Magazine.
Jennifer. How are you?
Nice to meet you in real life. We have only met through emails and publishing your work, and as an editor and also just a landscape historian, I really appreciate your emphasis on writing and not just publishing your research, but truly writing narratives that draw people in across kind of the spectrum of readers. And I was wondering if you were going to write a piece about something you didn't already know about, what might that piece be about?
Something that I didn't already know about.
Yeah. So, you know, instead of just publishing research you might have already done, like if you were going to take on something that you were curious about or didn't already kind of have a body of work behind, what kind of things would you be interested in writing about?
Well, I've always been interested in sound for years and years. I'm not a musician, but I've long felt that this is an underappreciated, underworked area. And so I don't know nothing about it. I joined the Acoustic Ecology Society about 30 years ago. I'm not an active member. I've read Murray Schafer's book, The Tuning of the World, and some of his books about specific cities, a soundscape of Vancouver, for example. So I'm really interested in sound, but I've also am realizing I'm currently working on and hopefully finishing within the next year and a half my book, The Buried River, Restoring Nature, Rebuilding Community. And so until I finish that, I'm not doing any other writing. But I'm getting towards I hope I can work forever. I hope that's, you know, that my capacities will allow me to continue to work. But if I were to do something I think I would, that I don't know very much about now, I would collaborate with a musician or an acoustical engineer and maybe other people who know sound and work on that. I think I gather that this is a coming thing now in the fields of landscape architecture and architecture, so maybe I don't have to do it. But yeah, it's if I look back and think of something that I wasn't able to do, that would be it. Yes, one more.
Hi, my name is Leah, and I'm the McHarg Fellow here at Penn, so it's my first year teaching at Penn. I was struck and really appreciated in Cindy's introduction the kind of description of insistence that you had in your early career, and I guess I'm kind of delighted by the beginning of your lecture where you're really paying tribute to your early career mentors and the professors here at Penn, and I'm curious how you think about encouraging kind of boundary pushing in your present teaching and the instilling kind of empowerment of students and an eye towards innovation at the same time that you're laying the foundation of the discipline in the classroom. So,
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to emphasize how important reflection is to me. From the time I was in graduate school, I would ask myself, what are my strengths? What do I really like to do? What makes me happy? So reflection is really, really important. And that's why I've had a lot of failures in the West Philadelphia Landscape Project over the last 38 years. But I always reflect on the failure, and I learn more from the failure probably than the successes. Because a success, you can mislead yourself. Oh, it was because I did such and such, But with a failure, you really have to think hard about what happened and how you can try again and take what you learned into account, and again and again and again and again. And I guess there were people along the way that gave me the courage and determination to keep going at this, what's now mainstream, green infrastructure to deal with combined sewer overflows, which I was laughed at about, literally laughed at in the mid 1980s, which seems so silly because Frederick Olmsted was doing stormwater management in Boston in the 1880s, and Ken Wright, the water engineer, was doing it. It wasn't for reasons of CSOs. It was for flood control. But so a colleague of mine a few years ago asked me the question, what do you do when your work pushes you outside your comfort zone? What do you do and how do you handle the criticism when you go outside your disciplinary boundaries? And my answer to him is that you don't have to do it alone. You can seek colleagues in other disciplines and collaborators and work with them. And I teach a course in ecological urbanism for many, many years. And my advice to my students years ago, as long as like 35 years ago, was find a really good water engineer as a colleague and work together, because water is going to be really, really critical. And yeah, we're seeing that now, right? But to look for others. When Frances Walker, my community partner in the Mill Creek neighborhood since 1997, called me up in 2018 and said, Anne, I need help. She had a problem with her mother's house. Her mother died without a will. It was a tangled deed. There were 18 heirs. She wanted to move into the house. She said, I know you can help. I said, Frances, I don't know anything about housing. And she said, but I know you can help. So fortunately, I have colleagues at MIT that know a whole lot more about housing than I do. And I reached out to them and, get their advice. And it turns out, in fact, at MIT, in my class, I often get students who are master's students who have already been in the field and working in the field of housing and have experience, and they know more than I do. And so they bring their experience into the classroom. So I think the thing to do is to not be afraid of, if you have some ideas, to not be afraid to cross over boundaries and seek help. Did that answer your question?
I wanted to say thank you so much, Anne, for your time and your talk today, and to everyone for the questions. We're really honored to have you here, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your background and your future plans for acoustic ecology writing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thanks
thank
so
you
much.
so much.